My name is Nadia Reeves, and I was 31 years old the night my mother introduced me to 47 dinner guests as someone who was still figuring things out. She didn't whisper it. She said it the way you'd say the weather, casual, factual, already moving on to the next person. This is Nadia, my youngest. She's between things right now, you know how it is. And she smiled, and the guests nodded, and I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water with both hands and said nothing. I had a film in post-production at that moment. I had a festival submission deadline in 11 days. I had a hard drive in my apartment with 4 years of footage, 2 years of editing, and one documentary that 3 separate people had already quietly told me was something. But I said nothing. I smiled back. I went and found a seat near the window. What my mother didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that in 3 weeks, a screen in a different city was going to show my name. And the people in that room were going to have a very different kind of moment than the one they were having right now. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let their records speak for them. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We post every week. And if you've ever had someone introduce you like you were a rough draft, drop a comment below. Let's get into it. I want to start at the beginning, because the end doesn't make sense without it. I grew up in a family that believed in credentials you could frame. Degrees on the wall. Business cards with titles on them. My father was a civil engineer for 32 years. My mother ran the administrative office of a private school for 19. My older sister, Renata, was a practicing orthodontist by the time she was 28. My brother Marcus had a law degree and a downtown office with his name on a frosted glass door. These were the visible things. The things that got mentioned at dinners and holidays and in conversations with neighbors. They were the vocabulary my family used to describe success. I grew up inside that vocabulary and understood it perfectly. I just never fit inside it. I knew by the time I was 16 that I wanted to make films. Not Hollywood blockbusters. I was never chasing that particular dream. I wanted to make documentary films. The kind that followed a single person or a single place for a long time. The kind that found something ordinary and looked at it until it became extraordinary. I don't know exactly where that impulse came from. My father used to take us to the Natural History Museum every summer, and I remember standing in front of an exhibit about deep-sea ecosystems and thinking, someone went down there. Someone pointed a camera at something no one had ever seen and brought it back up. That's what I wanted to do, but with people. With the overlooked corners of ordinary life. My parents were patient with this idea for approximately the length of my undergraduate years. I went to a state university 2 hours from home. I majored in communications with a film concentration, a degree choice that my mother described, at the time, as interesting, which was the word she used when she didn't want to say worrying. I was a good student. I worked on student productions. I shot a short documentary my junior year about a retired postal worker who had been delivering mail in the same 6-block radius for 40 years, and it won a small campus festival prize and got screened twice. I was proud of it. I think, looking back, that it was genuinely good for what it was. My mother came to neither screening. After graduation, I moved to Portland, a city my mother pronounced with the kind of tone usually reserved for places that are both far away and vaguely irresponsible. I got a job doing video production for a nonprofit, cutting grant report videos and donor content. It paid modestly. I lived modestly. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with a good north-facing window and a second-hand desk where I worked on my own projects in the evenings and on weekends. For the first 2 years out of school, my family's understanding of my career was this. Nadia makes videos for a charity and is figuring it out. This was not entirely inaccurate, but it was not the whole picture. The whole picture was that during those 2 years, I was also shooting the early material for what would become my documentary. I had found my subject in the first month I lived in Portland, a neighborhood community garden that occupied a full city block and had been run by the same group of volunteers for 22 years. What looked like a garden was actually a kind of living archive. There were families who had been tending the same plot for 3 generations. There were people who had met there, married, had children who now came to the same rows of tomatoes and squash their parents had grown. There were conflicts and histories and a whole ecosystem of relationships that had formed around this patch of earth in the middle of an increasingly dense city. I started filming with a borrowed camera in my second month in Portland. I kept filming for 4 years. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. I did not tell my family what I was working on in any detail. Not because I was hiding it, but because every time I tried to describe it, what came back from the other end of the conversation was a kind of polite incomprehension that I found more discouraging than outright skepticism. My sister Nadia once asked me, when I mentioned the project, how long a documentary like that took to make, and when I said probably 3 to 4 years total, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "And someone will pay you for that?" Not unkindly, genuinely curious. Just from a place so different from where I was standing that I couldn't quite build a bridge to it in the middle of a Sunday phone call. So, I stopped explaining. I kept working. I kept shooting. During this time, there was one person in my family who understood, or at least tried to. My grandmother on my mother's side, my grandma Edith, was still alive through most of those 4 years. She was in her mid-80s, sharp in the way that some people are sharp in old age, where the unnecessary things have been stripped away and what's left is just clear and direct and entirely without pretense. Grandma Edith had never been to college. She'd worked in a textile factory in her 20s, raised 4 children, and somewhere along the way become the most quietly competent person I had ever met. She could look at a situation and tell you in 2 sentences what everyone else would spend an hour dancing around. She visited me in Portland once, when I was about 3 years into the documentary. I took her to the garden, and we walked the rows for an hour. She didn't say much. At the end, she sat on a bench near the old tool shed and looked out at the plots and said, "This is real, Nadia. What you're making. Don't let them make you think it isn't." She passed away 14 months before the film was finished. I dedicated it to her. What she meant by them, I didn't have to ask. We both knew. Block 2. The betrayal in full. The charity dinner happened about 6 weeks before I submitted the film to festivals. My mother ran a small fundraising event every spring for a literacy nonprofit she'd been involved with for years. It was held at a rented event space downtown, 45 to 50 guests, a sit-down dinner, a brief program, a silent auction. It was genuinely a good cause, and she genuinely worked hard on it. I say that plainly because I don't want to make her a villain for the dinner itself. The dinner was a good thing. What happened at the dinner was a separate thing. I drove down for it because she'd asked me to come, and because I was between editing sessions and thought the drive would clear my head. I arrived early to help set up, spent an hour arranging centerpieces and checking auction items, and was mostly finished by the time guests began arriving at 6:30. The guests were a mix, colleagues of my mother's from the school, people from the nonprofits board, neighbors, some of my parents' friends from over the years. People who had watched me grow up from a distance who knew me mostly as Lynn's youngest and had a vague general impression that I did something with videos. My mother moved through the room greeting people the way she always did at these events, smooth and practiced and warm, with a very particular talent for making each person feel like they were the most important arrival of the evening. I watched her do it with genuine admiration. She was good at it. Then she reached a cluster of guests near the back of the room. 3 couples, board members I'd met once or twice over the years, and she brought me into the circle with a hand on my shoulder and said, with complete naturalness, "You remember my daughter Nadia? She's between things right now, creative work, you know how that goes. We're hoping she finds her footing soon." The words landed quietly. No one reacted to them as anything unusual. One of the women nodded sympathetically. One of the men asked if I was thinking about going back to school. My mother had already begun steering the conversation elsewhere. I said something short and non-committal. Something went very still in my chest. I excused myself a minute later and went to get another glass of water. I stood near the side table for a moment and reminded myself of a few things. That the film was nearly done. That I had submitted a cut to one festival juror contact I had, and that his response, received 2 weeks earlier, 3 sentences in an email, had used the words genuinely affecting and extraordinary access. That I knew what I was doing, even if the room I was currently standing in had no mechanism for understanding it. That helped a little. I went back to my seat. Over the course of the evening, I heard versions of the same introduction 4 more times. Not word for word. My mother adjusted the phrasing depending on the audience. With one neighbor it was, "Nadia's still exploring her options. She's always been the creative one. With a school colleague, she does freelance video work, still figuring out the long-term plan. With a woman I'd never met who asked what I did for work, my mother appeared at my elbow before I could answer and said, pleasantly, she's in a bit of a transitional phase. You know how it is after your 20s. Each time I let it pass. Each time I nodded or smiled or said something vague about projects I was working on, and each time my mother's expression carried the particular quality of someone who believed they were being graciously accurate. She wasn't lying, exactly, in her own understanding. She genuinely did not know the shape of what I had been building for 4 years. That was partly my fault. I had not pressed it, had not laid it out for her in terms she would register as real. But there is a kind of not knowing that is chosen. A not asking. A comfortable certainty that what you can't see clearly probably isn't much. And that was the variety of not knowing my mother had spent 4 years practicing, and I had let her practice it, and now I was sitting at a charity dinner being introduced as a rough draft. Late in the evening, after the program and the auction announcements, my father found me near the exit and asked how things were going, genuinely, just the two of us. I told him I was close to finishing a big project. He nodded and said he was glad to hear it. He looked like he wanted to ask more but wasn't quite sure what questions to ask. I told him I'd tell him about it when it was done. He squeezed my shoulder and went back to help stack chairs. I drove back to Portland that night and spent the next 11 days finishing the cut. Block 3, Arrival at the Public Event / the Freeze Beat. The Pacific Northwest Documentary Festival ran for 5 days in early October. It was not the largest festival I had submitted to. I had sent the film to 6 different festivals simultaneously, which is standard, and 2 of the others were bigger names. But the PNDF was the one I'd had my eye on for 2 years. It had a particular reputation for first-time feature documentarians. The previous 3 years' winners in the debut category had all gone on to distribution deals or streaming acquisitions or both. It was the kind of recognition that translated into a next project actually being funded. It was, in the industry I was trying to enter, a real door. I found out I'd been accepted into the official competition selection on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk eating leftover rice when the email came in. I read it 3 times. Then I sat still for about a minute. Then I called my editing partner, a woman named Simone who had been giving me feedback for the last year of the project, and she screamed loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear.
I did not call my family.
I thought about it. I decided to wait until I had something more concrete, a screening date, a time, something I could point to and say, here, this is happening, this is real. I wasn't hiding it. I'd been down this road before with partial news that got received as ambiguous, and I didn't want to spend another phone call translating. The festival opened on a Tuesday. I arrived in the city the morning before, checked into a small hotel 6 blocks from the main venue, and spent most of the first day at the Filmmaker orientation. There were 41 films in the official program across all categories, with 8 in the debut documentary competition. I met some of the other filmmakers at the orientation lunch. There was a man from Albuquerque who had made a film about hospice musicians. A woman from Montreal whose documentary followed 3 siblings fighting over their parents' bakery. We ate sandwiches in a conference room and talked about editing software and grant applications and the specific anxiety of waiting to hear a room react to something you'd built in private for years. The Filmmaker reception that first evening was held in the courtyard behind the main theater. It was a warm October, which Portland sometimes gets, and someone had strung lights between the old brick walls and put out long tables with wine and cheese and small printed cards describing each film. I found my card, read it, decided it was an adequate summary, and put it back. Gideon Hartley came through the reception shaking hands with each filmmaker. He was shorter than I expected from his photographs, compact, precise, with the unhurried manner of someone who had done this many times and still found it genuinely interesting. When he reached me, he held my hand a beat longer than a standard greeting and said, "I've seen your film.
I want you to know that."
He said nothing more. He moved to the next filmmaker. My chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. I went back to the hotel and did not sleep especially well. The second day of the festival, I watched 2 films from other competition sections, a short program in the morning and a feature in the afternoon, and spent the evening going over the Q&A questions I anticipated, writing down answers, and then deciding I probably shouldn't write down answers because the best Q&As never follow a script. I ate dinner alone at a ramen place 2 blocks from the hotel. I called Simone, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was what I needed. The screening was scheduled for the third day, a Friday evening. My film was slotted at 7:30 p.m. in the main theater. I had been told the capacity was 312 seats and that the debut competition screenings typically ran close to full. I arrived at the venue at 5:30 for the technical check. The projectionist was a calm, efficient man named Ray who had been running the booth at the festival for 9 years. We went through the file, checked the aspect ratio, checked the color calibration against a reference frame I had brought on a drive. He made one small brightness adjustment that I hadn't noticed was needed and immediately saw was correct once he made it. I thanked him. He said, "Good film," without looking up from his monitor.
Just that.
I walked back down the stairs to the lobby. My hands were cold from the lobby door to the concession table and back. The lobby filled between 6:15 and 7. I stood near the side wall and watched people come in, filmmakers from the other competition programs, industry people with lanyards, general audience members who had bought tickets through the public program. A woman near the entrance was handing out small printed programs for the evening screening. I took one and looked at my film's description again, which I had now read perhaps 30 times and which still managed to surprise me slightly each time. The way a photograph of yourself surprises you, it's accurate, but it isn't how you picture it from the inside. Gideon appeared at my elbow at 7:10. "How are you feeling?" he said. I told him fine, which was mostly true. "I meant what I said last night," he said. "I don't say that to everyone." He paused. "We were hoping to speak with you after the screening. The jury has questions, and so do I." He said it neutrally, carefully, the way you say something when the thing you're not saying is the actual content. Then he excused himself and went to take a seat. I found Simone near the back of the theater at 7:20. She grabbed both my arms when she saw me and said, "You look like you haven't slept." I told her I looked fine. She said I looked fine, and also like I hadn't slept. We sat in the back row together, the way we always did when my work was being screened. I needed to be able to see both the screen and the room. The lights went down at 7:32. The festival slate appeared, and then the title card, and then the first frame. I will not describe all 83 minutes of what followed. What I will say is that the room was quiet in the specific way a film audience is quiet when it is paying attention, which is different from the quiet of disengagement. You can feel the difference. Disengaged quiet has a kind of loose, drifting quality. Attentive quiet has weight to it. This room had weight. There were moments when I could hear individual audience members shift in their seats. There was a sequence about 40 minutes in, a conversation between the oldest gardener in the community and his adult daughter, filmed on a cold November morning with the beds all covered for winter, where the audience was so still that the ventilation system in the ceiling became audible. I had cut and recut that sequence 14 times over 8 months. I watched the screen and listened to the room and felt something in my shoulders release that I hadn't realized I had been holding. Near the end, the sequence with Edith's dedication card. My jaw tightened. I watched the screen. I did not look at Simone. When the lights came up, the applause started before the credits finished rolling. It built. Gideon Hartley was in the 5th row. He stood up. 3 people around him stood. Then a row further back. It was not a standing ovation in the full sense, maybe 70 of the 300 who were there, but in a documentary festival screening, in a room full of people who watch films for a living, 70 people standing is not a small thing. Someone near the front called out, "Is the director here?" Simone grabbed my arm. Hard. I raised my hand from the back of the room. About 170 people turned around. In the low light, I could see their faces reorienting, locating me, a woman in the back row, not standing at a podium, not arriving from a stage entrance, just sitting there in a dark coat with her arm raised. And then I saw her. My mother was in the 14th row. I had not invited her. I had not told her the date or the venue, or even the festival name. I had planned to tell her everything after the award ceremony, when I had the full arc of the story in hand. What I did not know was that my sister Nadia, in a rare moment of cross-sibling attention, had found the festival's public program online, apparently after a mutual cousin mentioned seeing my name somewhere, and had sent the link to my mother with a message. I think Nadia's film is in this. My mother had driven up that afternoon with my Aunt Carol. She was very still in the 14th row. Her program was in her lap, folded along the spine the way she always folded paper things. Her hands were pressed flat on top of it. She was not looking at me yet. She was looking at the screen, which was blank now, the credits finished, the white rectangle just sitting there in the dark. And then she turned, and she found me in the back row. Something moved across her face that I did not have a name for. Her mouth pressed together slightly. Her chin came up a fraction and then settled. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you are trying to reconcile two different versions of them, and the math isn't working. She raised her hand in a small wave.
Just that.
I nodded once. And then Gideon was making his way toward the microphone at the front of the room, and I got up and I walked down the aisle toward the stage. Block 4. The single reveal plus validation. I passed the 14th row, without stopping. I could feel my mother's eyes on my back as I walked past. My Aunt Carol was sitting one seat to her left, and I could see, in my peripheral vision, that Carol had turned to say something to my mother in a low voice. I kept walking. I reached the front of the theater and stood to the left of the microphone while Gideon settled himself, and the room came back to quiet. He waited until the last of the applause had fully died. He was good at that, letting silence do work. Then he said, I want to take a moment before the Q&A. I've been running this festival for 11 years. We screen approximately 40 films per cycle across all programs. Every few years there is one that makes the jury's job genuinely difficult, not because it is easy to dismiss, but because it is hard to put in conversation with anything else we've seen. This year, that film is the one you just watched. The room was still. Someone in the middle section shifted. No one spoke. The director spent 4 years inside a single community, Gideon continued. For years. Earning a level of trust that most documentary filmmakers don't achieve across a career. The people in this film speak and move and exist in front of her camera the way people only do when they have forgotten, or decided they don't care, that the camera is there. That is not a technical achievement. That is a human one. It takes a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of character. He paused again. He had the cadence of someone who understood that the pause was part of the sentence. What she made with that trust is not just a film about a garden. It is one of the most precise and humane portraits of how communities form and hold and sometimes fracture that I have seen at this festival. I say that having screened 412 films over 11 years in this role, I don't use the word precise lightly. He turned toward the back of the theater. Toward the back row.
Toward me.
We've been looking for you all evening, he said. Come on down. The applause started before I had taken a step. I walked down the aisle toward the front. 170 people were turned in their seats watching me come. The lights were still low enough that I couldn't see individual faces clearly until I was about halfway down. I was aware of my own breathing, measured, deliberate, the way it gets when I'm focused on something technical. I was not trembling. I was not doing the thing where you smile too wide because you don't know what else to do with your face. I walked to the microphone and I thanked Gideon and I looked out at the room. I did not look at the 14th row. I did not need to. The Q&A ran for 40 minutes. The questions were good, the kind you get from an audience that has actually watched the film, not the kind you get from people filling time. Someone asked about access. How had I earned the trust of the subjects so quickly? I told them it hadn't been quick. I told them 4 years is not quick. There was a small laugh, the kind that recognizes something true. Someone asked about the editing structure. Why that sequence order? Why not chronological? I talked for several minutes about the decision to organize by emotional logic rather than calendar logic, and the room leaned in the way rooms lean when the answer is actually landing. A woman near the front row asked about the dedication card. The one at the end, for Edith, who said it was real. I told her briefly about my grandmother, about the bench near the tool shed, about the way she had looked out at the plots and said what she said without any ceremony. The room was very quiet. My throat closed briefly around something I did not name. I finished the answer. I moved on. Near the end of the Q&A, Gideon came back to the microphone and mentioned that the film would be eligible for the jury's debut documentary prize, to be announced at the closing reception on Sunday. He did not editorialize. He said it factually. But several people in the audience glanced at each other in the particular way that people glance at each other when something already feels settled. When the formal Q&A ended, the house lights came up fully. The crowd began to move. 3 people made their way toward me before I had left the stage area. The first was a producer I recognized, a woman named Diane Sato from a Seattle-based independent company whose last 3 acquisitions I had tracked closely. She shook my hand and said she'd like to schedule a call at my earliest convenience. She gave me a card and held my hand a beat longer than necessary, which I registered as meaningful. The second was a film critic from a regional publication who covered documentaries specifically, asking if I had time for a longer interview before the end of the festival. The third was a woman in her 60s who said she had grown up 1 block from the garden and had no idea this film existed. She stood in front of me with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and said, "Thank you," twice, and didn't seem to need anything else from me, just have said it. I told her she was welcome. I meant it completely. When the cluster around me thinned, I looked back toward the center of the theater. My mother and my Aunt Carol were still in the 14th row. The theater was emptying around them, people filing out through both exits, talking in the low animated voices of an audience that has seen something they want to discuss, and my mother and Carol sat in the middle of it like 2 people in a tide, not moving. My mother was looking at the stage. At the microphone I had just left, her program was still folded in her lap. Her posture was the very precise, very composed posture of someone working hard at composure. She looked up and found me looking at her from across the empty rows. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she raised her hand again, the same small wave as before. And this time there was something different in it. The first wave, when the lights had come up after the film, had been uncertain, the reflex of a woman who didn't know what she was seeing. This wave was different. This wave knew exactly what it was acknowledging. Her chin was up, her shoulders were still, and her eyes were doing something that her face was not quite admitting to. Simone appeared at my elbow. "The producer," she said quietly. "Don't let her leave." I turned back to the room. I went and found Diane Sato near the exit doors. We talked for 12 minutes. She confirmed she had acquisition interest. We agreed on a call for the following week. When I looked back at the 14th row, it was empty. Block 5, social/financial cascade, plus pleading reversal. The awards were announced Sunday afternoon at the closing reception in the festival's courtyard. I won the debut documentary prize. I will say it plainly, because there is no graceful way to understate it that doesn't become its own performance. The jury citation was read aloud by the jury chair, a documentary filmmaker who had been doing this work for 30 years, and it said, in part, "For a film that demonstrates exceptional patience and clarity of vision, and an earned intimacy with its subjects that is rare in any director, let alone a first-time feature filmmaker." I shook the jury chair's hand. I took the award, a small, heavy object, glass and steel, unremarkable to look at. I said something at the microphone. I thanked Simone. I said something about my grandmother that I had not planned to say and had to pause briefly in the middle of, my jaw tightening against something that wanted to come through. There were 83 people in the courtyard. I counted afterward because it seemed like the kind of detail I wanted to remember accurately. My mother was not at the closing reception. She had driven back Saturday morning. I knew this because she had sent me a text at 9 a.m. that said, "We're heading back. I want to talk when you have time. I'm proud of you, Nadia." 7 words that I had read standing in the hotel hallway in my socks, and read again twice before I put my phone in my pocket and went to get coffee. The phone call came Sunday evening about 40 minutes after the awards. She had been watching the festival's social media, apparently. The festival had posted a photo of me at the podium with a short caption that included the phrase, "First-time feature winner," and tagged the film's title. My sister Nadia had shared it in the family group text before my mother had even seen it, with a message that just said, "Nadia." My mother called at 7:14. I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in the same clothes I'd worn to the reception. "Nadia," she said. "I saw." I said that was good. She was quiet. Not the quiet of someone looking for words. The quiet of someone who has already found them and is deciding whether to say them. I've been thinking since Friday night, she said finally. Since the theater. I've been sitting with it. I waited. I didn't know, she said. I mean, I knew you were working on something. You mentioned it. But I didn't ask what it was. I didn't ask because I think I'd already decided it wasn't, she stopped. Started again. I'd already decided it wasn't the kind of thing that counted.
And I was wrong about that.
I was wrong, and I said things in front of people that weren't fair to you, and I want you to know that I know that. Her voice was even. Measured. She was not a woman who cried on the phone, and she wasn't crying. But there was something underneath the evenness, a thinness in it, a careful quality, that told me she had rehearsed this and was grateful she had. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I meant that. The film is, she paused again.
The things that man said. Gideon.
400 films. 11 years. I was sitting there, and I kept thinking, when did she make this? When was she making this? And I realized she was making it the whole time. She was making it all those years I was telling people. She was figuring things out. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to add. I'm sorry, Nadia, she said. For the dinner. For the way I've talked about your work. That was mine, that was my limitation, and it wasn't right. We talked for another 25 minutes. She asked questions about the film, real questions, the kind she hadn't asked in 4 years. She wanted to know about the garden, about the subjects, about how I had convinced people to let me film them for that long. She asked what distribution meant practically, and I explained it to her, and she listened carefully and asked follow-up questions, and I thought, not for the first time, that she was actually a very intelligent woman whose intelligence had simply never been pointed at my work before. Before we hung up, she asked if she could see the film. I told her I would send her a screener link as soon as the festival exclusivity window closed, which would be about 8 weeks. She said she would wait. My father called the next morning, Monday, at 8:15. He had read the full jury citation on the festival's website and had apparently read it more than once, because when I picked up he said, without preamble, exceptional patience and clarity of vision. Just that. Quoting it. The way you quote something when you're trying to understand what it means about a person you thought you already understood. His voice had the particular quality of someone being careful. Careful not to make it about himself. Careful not to reach for the wrong register. He asked me about the Seattle producer. He asked about next steps. He asked, and this was the one that landed in my chest in a specific way, is this what you've been doing all along? This whole time? This is what you were building? I told him yes. That was what I'd been building. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should have asked more. I didn't know what to ask, but I should have tried harder.
He paused.
I'm proud of you. I want to make sure I say that directly. I told him I heard him. I meant it. Renata texted that same morning. I knew it was something when I found the festival program. Dinner was not okay, what Mom said. I'm sorry I didn't say something that night. And then, a minute later, the jury citation is incredible. Will you send me a screener when you can? I told her I would. She sent back a single emoji, a small blue heart, and nothing else, which from Renata was the equivalent of a speech. Marcus called 2 days after I got home. He was somewhat flustered, in the way that Marcus gets flustered, controlled, but with a very slight looseness around the edges of his sentences that he can't quite suppress. He said his client, a woman who had been at the festival as part of the industry program, had asked him at their last meeting whether he was related to the documentary filmmaker who had won the debut prize. Had said she'd seen the film at the screening. Had used the words remarkable and stayed with me. I didn't know what to tell her, Marcus said. I said yes. I said that was my sister. He paused. I should have been able to tell her more than that, he said. I should have known more than that. I told him that was fair. Send me the festival page, he said. I sent him the link. He called back an hour later and read me the jury citation aloud, the same way my father had. His voice had the same careful quality. Different register. Marcus is more formal than my father, always has been, but the same careful quality underneath it. The quality of someone recalibrating. This is really something, Nadia, he said.
This is really something.
I told him I knew. I kept my voice even. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. I had built something real over 4 years, and it had become visible. That was the sum of it. My family was recalibrating around a version of me that had existed the entire time they were working from the old version. That wasn't a victory. It was just a correction. A long, quiet correction that had taken 4 years and a festival and a man with a microphone in a theater with 300 seats to deliver. My Aunt Carol, who had been in row 14, told her book club about the screening the week after she got home. I know this because 2 of the book club members apparently looked up the film afterward, and one of them, a woman who turned out to work in arts programming for the city, sent an inquiry through the festival's contact form asking about community screening rights for future date. That inquiry found its way to me 6 weeks later. I answered it. The acquisition conversation with Diane Sato moved forward through October and into November. That process is ongoing, and I won't discuss the specifics, but I will say it is real, and it is moving, and it involves a number that is more than I have earned in any previous year. The film will be seen by more people than were in that theater. I hold that knowledge the same way I held the work for 4 years, quietly, without making too much of it, letting it be what it is. Block 6, Moral Aphorism. There is something I have thought about since that Friday evening in October. My mother was not technically wrong about most of what she said at the dinner. I was, in a narrow sense, between things, between the making and the public life of the thing. I had not published anything she could point to. I had not won anything she could name. From outside the work, looking in without asking, there was very little visible evidence that I was doing anything at all. The error was not the observation. The error was the certainty. The comfortable assumption that what she could not see was not there. That assumption is not unusual. Most families do it. Most people do it. We measure what we can measure, draw conclusions from the measurement, and forget that measurement requires instruments, and that we might not have the right ones. The quiet thing you tend for a long time eventually shows. Block 7. Rulo F3 Recap. That's my story. A garden. A dedication card. And a row 14 that sat still while the rest of the theater emptied. Block 8. Audience question plus CTA. Here's what I want to ask you before you go. Has anyone in your family ever introduced you to someone using the most convenient version of you? The version that fit their story, instead of the true one? Did you correct them in the moment? Or did you let it go and trust that the work would speak eventually? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.